At 3:47 a.m. local time, the most dangerous thing in the Strait of Hormuz wasn't a missile. It was a merchant ship that refused to turn around. A sanctioned hull, flagged, insured, and crewed through layers of paperwork designed to make ownership hard to trace, kept its course through the narrowest maritime chokepoint on Earth while warships watched from over the horizon and drones watched from above. No explosions, no dramatic intercept footage, just the sound that decides whether a blockade is real or just a press release. Radio traffic, unanswered warnings, and the quiet certainty of steel moving forward anyway. And as those U.S. sanctioned ships transited Hormuz, China publicly called President Trump's blockade dangerous. That word, dangerous, is not diplomatic filler. It's a signal. It means Beijing believes this is no longer just an Iran story, or a U.S. domestic politics story, or a sanctions story. It's a global shipping story now. And when the Strait of Hormuz becomes the battleground for credibility between Washington and Tehran, and the world's second largest economy starts issuing warnings, you are looking at the early stages of something that can move oil markets, fracture alliances, and trigger escalation without anyone choosing a war. Because in the Gulf, war doesn't always start with a strike. Sometimes it starts with a ship that passes. Let me explain what this headline actually means, what a blockade looks like when it collides with sanctions enforcement and great power politics, and why the next transit through Hormuz could be the one that forces someone to fire the first shot. Here's the story the mainstream headlines won't fully connect for you. A blockade is about control. Sanctions are about compliance. The Strait of Hormuz is about leverage. And China's warning is about a red line you don't see on any map. First, you need to understand the Strait of Hormuz. Most people imagine it as a wide open ocean lane. It's not. It's a choke point, one of the few places on Earth where the global economy funnels into a narrow corridor and simply has to trust that nobody will pull the pin. At its narrowest, the strait is roughly 21 miles wide. But the usable shipping lanes, the traffic separation scheme that keeps tankers from colliding, are far tighter. In practice, you have narrow channels for inbound and outbound traffic with a buffer zone between them. That means ships don't have unlimited room to maneuver. And that's why any attempt to block port access or restrict shipping related to Iran becomes exponentially more dangerous near Hormuz. Because in a narrow lane, interdiction is not theoretical. It's physical. A warship pulls alongside. A helicopter circles. A boarding team prepares. A merchant captain has to decide whether to slow, stop, comply, or keep moving. And every one of those decisions is happening under stress, at night, in congested water, with language barriers, legal ambiguity, and the knowledge that one mistake becomes a headline, and then a crisis. So when you hear that U.S. sanctioned ships pass through Hormuz, what you're really hearing is that the world just watched a live test of enforcement. Did the blockade stop them? Did the U.S. interdict them? Did someone blink? Because the credibility of a blockade isn't established by a speech in Washington. It's established by what happens to ships when they actually move. Now let's talk about the word sanctioned, because this is where confusion becomes weaponized. A ship can be sanctioned in several ways. It can be owned by an entity under sanctions. It can be managed by a sanctioned company. It can be carrying cargo tied to sanctioned trade. It can be insured by a network that's been flagged. It can be flagged under a country that is itself not sanctioned, but used as a cover. This matters because enforcement becomes a game of paperwork, intelligence, and proof. And proof takes time. If you're trying to interdict a ship in real time, you have seconds to make decisions, while the legal case for why that ship is sanctionable might take days to assemble in a courtroom. That gap between operational speed and legal certainty is where crises are born, because a blockade enforcement action that is wrong in legal terms isn't just embarrassing. It can be politically catastrophic. It can push neutral countries to side against the U.S. It can give Iran a narrative of illegitimacy, and it can give China the opening it wants to argue that Washington is destabilizing global trade under the banner of rules while breaking those rules in practice. That is why China calling the blockade dangerous is not only about Iran, it's about the global system. Beijing is telling the world this blockade threatens freedom of navigation, threatens energy flows, and threatens a core principle that China wants to claim it defends: stability. And the irony is that China benefits from U.S. protected sea lanes. It always has. But China also benefits from U.S. mistakes. Because if Washington is seen as the actor turning shipping lanes into a battleground, Beijing gets to position itself as the responsible power without firing a shot. That is the strategic layer hiding inside this headline. Now let's connect the pieces. You have a reported Trump blockade aimed at Iran's maritime lifelines. You have sanctioned ships still transiting Hormuz. And you have China warning that the strategy itself is dangerous. So what happened operationally? Based on public reporting, it appears ships associated with sanctioned networks still moved through the strait. either because enforcement is selective, delayed, limited by rules of engagement, limited by coalition politics, or because the US is choosing not to physically stop every ship in order to avoid the incident that triggers escalation. That's the thing about blockades. The public imagines a hard wall. In real life, most modern blockades function like a pressure valve. They apply friction, they increase cost, they create risk, they deter some traffic, they punish others later through seizures, fines, and insurance denial, and they rely on a simple psychological mechanism. Most companies will comply if compliance is cheaper than defiance. But if defiance is seen to work, if sanctioned ships pass through without consequence, then everyone watching learns a lesson too. Not the lesson Washington wants. That's why one transit can matter more than a dozen speeches, because it becomes a precedent. It tells the shipping industry what the real rules are, and it tells Iran whether the blockade is a sustainable choke or a symbolic gesture. Let's talk about the shipping industry for a minute, because this is where the real power lives. Shipping doesn't need certainty. It needs insurability. If insurers decide the Gulf is too risky, ships stop going, not because governments ordered it, but because the math becomes impossible. So a blockade can succeed even with limited interdictions if it triggers insurance premiums, route delays, and port refusals. But the opposite is also true. If ship owners watch sanctioned ships transit Hormuz and dock without consequence, risk perception drops, premiums stabilize, the deterrent effect weakens. That means the US may feel pressure to escalate enforcement, physically. More boardings, more diversions, more seizures. And that is where dangerous becomes the correct word, because physical enforcement is where accidents happen. Now here's the part that's easy to miss. Iran doesn't have to defeat a blockade to win a round. It only has to raise the cost of enforcement. It only has to create enough friction that Washington's allies start asking whether this is worth it. And the Strait of Hormuz is the perfect environment for that, because it concentrates risk. Iran has multiple options to impose risk without launching a conventional war. Those options can include harassment, shadowing, drone overflights, maritime militia tactics, and selective pressure on commercial vessels tied to U.S. partners. I'm not predicting specific attacks. I'm telling you the logic of the theater. In the Gulf, the side that can create uncertainty can move markets and politics faster than the side that can sink ships. That's why blockade policy is never just naval policy. It's risk policy. So why is China speaking up now? Because China's exposure is real. China is the world's largest energy importer. Disruption in the Gulf is not abstract for Beijing. Even if China can source oil elsewhere, the price is set globally. Shipping insurance costs are global. Risk premiums are global. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable, China pays immediately. But China also has an additional motive. This is a chance to contest U.S. legitimacy. Beijing doesn't need to send a fleet to dominate the Gulf. It can accomplish strategic objectives by shaping international opinion, portraying the U.S. as the destabilizer, portraying sanctions and blockades as economic warfare, and positioning China as the defender of trade and stability. It's a rhetorical campaign, but it's not empty. Because rhetoric shapes coalition behavior, and coalition behavior shapes whether a blockade can be sustained. Blockades are rarely enforced by one country alone in practice. They require access, basing, intelligence sharing, and political cooperation. If China can increase political costs on U.S. partners by warning of danger, by pressuring through trade relationships, by framing the blockade as reckless, then the blockade weakens without China ever confronting the U.S. Navy directly. That's how great powers fight in 2026, indirectly, through the system. Now let me tell you the most important part of this headline. It's not sanctioned ships pass. It's the implication that we are entering a phase where three forces are colliding in the same narrow water. U.S. blockade credibility, Iran's asymmetric leverage, China's global narrative, and economic stake. When those three collide, incidents become more likely. Not because anyone wants them, but because everyone is playing a credibility game. Washington cannot appear powerless. Iran cannot appear contained. China cannot appear irrelevant. And the Strait of Hormuz is where credibility turns into collision. That's what makes this dangerous. So what happens next? If you want to track whether this escalates, ignore the talking heads and watch these 5 indicators, the ones that actually tell you what's happening under the surface. Indicator 1, insurance and classification changes. If war risk premiums spike, if insurers add exclusions, if major underwriters quietly pull coverage, traffic will thin even without a single interdiction. Indicator 2, port behavior. Ports and transshipment hubs may start refusing certain cargoes or refusing ship calls tied to sanction risk, even if governments don't announce it. That's a silent form of blockade expansion. Indicator 3, interdiction tempo. How often are ships being hailed? How often are boardings attempted? Are vessels being diverted, delayed, or detained? The tempo tells you whether enforcement is tightening. Indicator 4, Iranian signaling. Not just what Iran says, but what shows up at sea. Increased patrol presence, more close shadowing, more drone activity, more warnings. Those are often precursors to a more confrontational phase. Indicator 5, China's next step. A single statement is one thing, but if China starts coordinating public opposition, offering alternative financial mechanisms, urging international bodies to condemn the blockade, or increasing diplomatic engagement with Gulf states, that's a sign Beijing is actively trying to shape the outcome. And if China's language intensifies, from dangerous to unacceptable, from warning to consequences, that's when this starts to look like a great power contest playing out through Iran. Now, the biggest risk scenario is not planned war. The biggest risk scenario is accidental war. Here's what accidental war looks like in the Gulf. A U.S. warship attempts to stop or divert a vessel. The vessel refuses or delays compliance. A small craft approaches, real or perceived. A helicopter misraids a maneuver. A warning shot becomes an injury. A crew member dies. And then both sides are forced to respond, not because they chose escalation, but because domestic politics and credibility demand it. That chain has happened before in other forms. The Gulf is a place where incidents become history. And once blood is spilled, the blockade stops being an economic pressure tool and becomes a military confrontation. That's why every transit matters, because every transit is another roll of the dice. Let's zoom out and translate the strategic meaning into plain English. If sanctioned ships can pass through Hormuz while China condemns the blockade, then Washington faces a dilemma. Enforce harder and risk a crisis, or enforce softer and risk the blockade becoming performative. And Iran faces its own dilemma. Escalate to break the blockade and risk a broader war, or tolerate pressure and risk economic strangulation. Meanwhile, China is doing what China does best, increasing the political cost of U.S. actions while avoiding direct military entanglement. So the headline is not just a report. It's a warning sign that the Gulf is becoming a credibility arena again, and credibility arenas are where rational actors do irrational things, because the cost of backing down feels higher than the cost of stepping forward. They'll show you ships moving through a strait and treat it like background footage. They'll quote China, calling it dangerous, and move on. But the real question, the one that decides whether this stays an economic confrontation or becomes something worse, is simple. What happens the next time a sanctioned ship transits Hormuz and someone decides it can't be allowed to pass? Because the first pass is a message, the second pass is a challenge, and the third pass is where somebody proves whether the blockade is real. Subscribe for daily briefings that connect the mechanics, shipping, insurance, choke points, enforcement, to the outcomes that matter. Because in the Strait of Hormuz, the difference between pressure and war is often just one radio call that doesn't get answered.